Jasper. Welcome back to This Is Horror.
Thank you very, very much. It is superb to be back. It's been, hours perhaps since we last spoke.
Yeah, I think in reality it might have been a month or so, or possibly only a
Few
few
weeks.
weeks. I'm not sure. Time is important. Time is unimportant, but it's
It's
constantly
elastic in the
moving
world of
forward.
production.
Has anything significant happened in the last few weeks for you?
Lost a very good friend to lung cancer.
Hmm.
Um, my daughter got engaged, eldest daughter. That takes me one step closer to being a grandparent. Um, handed in the final edits on a new novel, signed off a novella. I think that's about it, actually.
You think that's about it, do you?
Probably
Oh
not some of
my
the things
goodness. I mean, you have I didn't expect you to say that much had happened in the last few weeks, but your answer has possibly included more life events than some people when I asked them after a year what they've been doing.
Yeah, I guess. Um, so maybe it has been quite yeah, or maybe kind of like I'm just sort of like every 2 weeks I'm like trying to fit a lifetime's worth of events in. Perhaps I'm like reincarnating over and over again within the same life. Or maybe I have like a bunch of lives that are waiting to be reincarnated in the one time. There's been too much of a backlog, so I've got to go through way too many like life experiences, and also develop way too many grey hairs as a consequence in places I
Well,
don't even want to mention
well, I think in saying you don't
or
want to
explain.
mention, you just mentioned them.
I think I might have done, but at least I didn't actually get them out here on camera. For those of you who
Well,
are watching on YouTube,
yeah, well, thank you for not doing that
not
because
a
we
mistake.
don't want to get the video banned early doors, and
No,
ideally, we don't want to get it banned at all. But with the quantity of rum that you might drink in the next 2 hours, we never know.
who knows? How many life experiences do you think I can actually fit into this one individual experience, including getting cancelled completely?
Well, for
Let's hope
people
not.
who are watching along, then send your answers to michael@thisishorror.co.uk, and you'll find out how many by the end of the episode. And on that note, we are going to talk about your fantastic 3 volume series, Draw You In.
Right.
And
For those who aren't watching and just listening, I've just held up the cover to the first book, Draw You In, and because that will feel a bit lonely, I'm going to hold up the volume 2 and volume 3. You might have noticed as well, if you've been paying attention, actually, that each subsequent cover is like a mise en abyss, because there are an inordinate number of stories within stories within stories, even to the degree that one of the stories within the actual overall plot arc eventually becomes a character within the story itself. So we kind of wanted to reflect this in the covers, because each cover contains the cover to the previous volume within it. And we continue that as well, because this is part of a series of books called Bark Bites Horror, which is kind of like a Goosebumps for grown-ups, or a sexed up scary story to tell in the dark. And I actually introduce each one a bit like the Crypt Keeper from Tales from the Crypt, as a cartoon version of myself. And even the cartoon introductions for these 3 books, each one of the introductions also contains the introduction to the previous thing within it. So there's a lot of thought going into folding narratives into narratives into narratives into narratives without the whole
since you,
narrative. Yeah.
yeah, since you've mentioned the artwork, we should talk about, who's responsible for the artwork, both the cover and the internals.
The artwork for the covers is done by the awesome Ben Baldwin, who did has done every one of the Bark Bites horror covers so far, but sadly hasn't done the next two installments, which are currently awaiting publication. And the artist for the little comic strip introductions in this case was the amazing Russ Leach, who is a British. They're both British artists. Ben is a cover artist, and I think he also does album covers and concept art. And Russ is a comic strip artist who's worked on a whole host of different strips, including Doctor Who and also several Marvel comics work as well. And
Yeah,
also been drawing your dear old Uncle Jasper.
I had a feeling when I saw the covers that they were probably Ben Baldwin pieces of art. And I mean, when I first got into the British horror scene, I'd say that Ben Baldwin and Vincent Young were the two names who, if there was a really good cover, it was by one of them.
It's been a real pleasure to work with them. And the idea behind the cover, again, for those who are just listening and aren't seeing, we've got like a little inkwell in which an eyeball is bobbing right at the top in the ink, and somebody is about to dip what is known as a speedball dip pen, which is also used by many comic strip artists to ink. This is a bit of an antique one, but we're also paying homage to. You might remember I used to write for many years a column for This Is Horror called Injured Eyeballs, and the injured
Yes.
eyeball motif was a very big thing, particularly in 1950s horror comics. There were lots of cover shots of like large eyeballs with flaming hot pokers or swords or needles about to stab it. We couldn't quite get that graphic on a cover and get it past Amazon, so we suggested it. So again, it's paying homage to a very specific cover that's linked to horror comics, and horror comics and the history of horror comics from the 1950s all the way through to the present day are the backdrop to all three novels in the Draw You In trilogy, which is also, in some ways, it's like a paranormal thriller and conspiracy theory, but it also is a road trip through the United States. It's a road trip through the secret history of the United States and what actually happened. And it's kind of a love letter to the horror genre because it actually, as well as driving through all the states and in a number of different locations, it also kind of takes a bit of a meander and a drive through most different subgenres in the horror genre, from extreme horror to psychological horror, from like extreme horror to even quiet horror, and most of the little pit stops you can think of.
Oh, yeah, this is an enormously ambitious book because you have the main narrative, but you've also got so much comic book history. You could actually take all of those parts and have a non-fiction book on the history of horror comics, and then you have the embedded stories, the stories within the story that bring to mind the likes of the Canterbury Tales and then Chuck Palahniuk's Haunted. So, I mean, goodness, when you kind of set about to write this, what was the initial genesis, and at what moment did you realize you were going to be putting so much into one book, which is actually three books?
Um, I think the initial genesis was, of all people, I was quite late to read James Herbert. I'd always known about James Herbert, and the kind of things of James Herbert's books that I'd read had kind of been when they were passed around the school ground, like in the early 1980s, and the book would always fall open at certain places, and so you'd kind of read the bit in the fog where the groundskeeper gets his penis chopped off, or where the woman is leaving her female lover, at the last minute decides not to commit suicide, and a giant wave of like suicides push her back into the sea. But I never actually sat down and read them all. And it was around about the time Herbert had died, I thought, oh, really must properly catch up. And I rather fell in love, even though they're not his best written books. I rather fell in love with the early 70s books, starting with the Rats and going through to like the Dark. And the usual, the kind of formula for them is there is a big bad, a nebulous threat like a fog or a sentient dark or the disembodied souls of plane crash victims, which wreak havoc in a particular geographic location. And there's like two kind of narrative thrusts. There's the main thrust, which is the big bad, it's coming, and then there's a small group of plucky heroes and heroines who do their best to stop it. Usually having to fight bureaucracy and myopic authorities in order to put it down. And then every 3 or 4 chapters, we cut away and we get like a tiny vignette where we get a victim who goes up against the big bad. And those are always my favourite bits, and I think they're many people's favourite bits of the of all these books. And actually, even the bits I mentioned about the book falling open to, those are usually the bits that you really like. And I quite like this as a literary conceit. And I thought, what could I do with that? So initially speaking, I sort of thought, what's my big bad? What's it doing? And how can I have these cutaways? That was my first thought. But then I realized as well that I could. It's always great to write about not just the things that you know, but the things that you love. Write about your passions and things you want to celebrate. I've been a comics professional for about 25 years now. And at one point, I supported myself entirely by writing comics for the British and the European market and a tiny little bit for the American market. And although I wrote pretty much as a hack anything that anyone would pay me, the big love from childhood has always been horror comics. Since it was stumbling on a black and white British reprint of The Tomb of Dracula by Marvel Comics comic by Marvel Wolfman and Gene Colan at age about 5, and opening up and looking at Gene Colan's strange artwork and his fabulous depiction of vampires and lords of the undead terrified me, completely warped and twisted me at a seminal age, 5 years old. And I never lost that love and that fascination and that terror for horror comics, particularly black and white horror comics. So I've always been really, really fascinated with them and really quite fascinated with their history, particularly as back in the 1950s, in fact, 1954, 55, there was a giant like moral panic surrounding horror comics. Juvenile delinquency was spiraling out of control. There was a fascinating left-wing senator called Estes Kefauver who made a huge national name for himself going after organized crime and was looking for his next big like crusade. And he hit upon juvenile delinquency and horror comics. And he actually interviewed nationally on national television, which those days, the 1950s, was quite an event because you didn't really get coast to coast broadcasting due to the technology at the time. But this was broadcast coast to coast, and the main publisher of EC Horror Comics, which were the single best comics being published pretty much anywhere in the world at that point, came on to argue that this is an adult art form. This is ridiculous censorship. And he, at the time, he was like trying to combat his weight taking Dexys, which his doctor had given him. So he was like huge like speed come up, and they made him sit about and wait for hours and hours and hours. And by the time he got in front of the committee, he'd crashed. And although he was a very eloquent publisher, he wasn't up to the type of cross-examination he would get at the hands of seasoned veteran politicians that he was up against, and they tore him a new arsehole. And everybody in the comics industry was watching on the television sets as they were sitting at their drawing board, like with their head in their hands, thinking, he's absolutely shafted us all. And he knew it at that time as well. And as a consequence, there was this massive moral backlash against comics. Concerned citizens and parents and scoutmasters and moral guardians of the youth organized giant, great comic book burnings. And in order to protect itself, the industry introduced the Comics Code Authority, and which was basically a giant censorship. And if ever you bought a comic from it's sometime in the late 50s all the way through to the early 80s, you might have noticed in the top left hand corner it had almost like looks like a little postage stamp saying approved by the Comics Code Authority, meaning this has been totally and utterly and completely censored half to death. And so although we've throughout the kind of history we've had big moral scares around things like everything from like rock and roll when it first came out to metal to rap to hip hop, and we had that little kind of like parental advisory stickers put in it. You've never effectively had such a massive backlash against an incredibly popular art form that was really pushing the boundaries, and was producing some amazing artwork, some fantastic stories, some incredibly progressive adult themes being dealt with in comics, and ever had an art form quite so effectively shut down. In Britain, they actually passed a law making it illegal to print or sell American horror comics. I mean, we've never, ever in the history of, I think, of Europe or even America actually seen a law passed. And the same thing happened in Australia as well. They passed laws actually directly banning an entire creative medium. And however bad things got, for metal or black metal or supposed Satanism in music or sexism and racism in hip hop, nobody passed a law actually banning it and shutting it down. And they did that for horror comics, and it didn't just hit the horror comics. It shut down 3/4 of an incredibly thriving publishing industry, brought it to these, and it wasn't until the 1960s when Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, with the help of Stan Lee, invented the Marvel Comics universe, that comics got off its knees and started selling in any significant numbers again. But it was still a pale reflection of what it had been before this giant moral panic. That's always interested me, and it's always a story that we've kind of like almost forgotten about and brushed under the carpet or swept to the margins, both of the of the history of creative endeavors, literature, and comics itself. So I thought I want to write about this and put that against a backdrop. So part of my big bad involved horror comics, and three completely disparate characters get drawn into an investigation, supposed by the FBI, into the life of a strange, legendary but marginalized horror comics artist known as R.L. Carver. It starts when an artist who's now in her middle age, but has been, a couple of decades ago, a hot new female artist. Now her kind of like career is kind of like somewhat washed up, which happens to a lot of comics professionals, unfortunately. She's given the opportunity to perhaps reinvent her career and revive her career, but at a Comic-Con. But her former editor, who is supposedly a person of some power and influence within the comics industry, entirely disappears. But not just disappears. Suddenly, it appears within a matter of hours, he has utterly ceased to exist or have ever existed, and she can't accept this. And so she goes in search of him, and she meets his former colleagues, none of whom know him, and she even tracks down his mum at one point. And she has no recollection of ever having a child, and she can't let go of this. And she even goes and reports him as a missing person, or almost gets into trouble for filing a wrong missing persons report. And then she set off a red flag on some FBI investigation. This guy gets in touch with her and says, I have been investigating a case which is incredibly similar to this. And bizarrely enough, both cases involve this forgotten figure from comics history, this absolute genius who was almost too talented to for the whole comics industry to support him. So they go in search of this character and try to find the secret history of this character. And in doing so, they uncover the history of horror comics from the 1950s to the present day. And also, they begin to uncover the secret history of the United States as they do so.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask
Hmm.
because I know during the comics code, the like Warren Publishing got around the code by issuing in a magazine format. Were those magazines, and when I mean that, it's like your creepy, eerie Vampirella, Savage Sword of Conan, those particular were actually in a bigger format than your actual standard comic, and so it was what they called a magazine. Were those magazines also banned in Europe, or
No,
were they available?
they were available. Actually, it was back to Max Gaines, who started EC. William Gaines, Bill Gaines, sorry, who started.
Mm-hmm.
Max Gaines was his dad, who actually started comics, but that's another story. Bill Gaines, he was publishing Mad, which was originally a comic. And in order not to lose Harvey Kurtzman, who was the genius behind Mad, he said, okay, we'll make it into a magazine. But then when his whole kind of publishing empire folded, the only thing he had left was Mad, and he turned it into a magazine. And because it was a magazine, it was an adult publication, and therefore not didn't have to carry the comics code authority on it. And it was Jim Warren who published Warren Comics, who then thought, and also famously was having success with famous Monster Filmland with Forrest J. Ackerman, who then decided he had some success publishing comics in famous Monster Filmland, and thought, why don't we launch a horror comic? These horror comics were they weren't actually as gory or as violent, initially speaking, not until about in the first kind of like 10 years of their publication. But they did bring back a lot of the artists and writers who'd worked in EC horror comics. But they weren't subject to the same strictures because they were a magazine. It was a very, very clever workaround. And enough
Mm-hmm.
time had passed from the giant moral scare for people to move on. And by that point, they were worried about people having hair that was too long and listening to this terrible psychedelic music. So, kind of like the whole kind of public conversation had moved on. Interestingly, black and white horror comics that were published here in the UK. There was a publisher called Len Miller, and he was still reprinting in black and white horror comics, and he was actually taken to court in the 1970s. But at that point, we were about 5 or 6 years behind. It was like the beginning of the 70s that they started publishing Warren Comics and also Skywald Comics, which are actually the best of the black and white 1970s horror comics. They are barking mad, sheer genius, and sometimes incredibly bloody and violent. And there's another publication as well called Eerie Publications, who put out. They used to reprint the horror comics from the 1950s, but they actually used to paint more blood and more guts and more gouged eyeballs and like torn cheeks, just to kind of make the stories more interesting. And then when they reprinted these like 100,000 times, and people were getting sick of the same reprints, and also kind of it was like the mid 70s, and these looked kind of hokey with all the kind of costumes. He actually then went and Myron Fass, who was the publisher behind Eerie Publications, went and hired a bunch of incredibly cheap South American artists to redraw the same stories with even more gore, with 1970s fashions. And sometimes, like 3 or 4 artists would simply redraw the same story and rename it. And these things again, they were available in the mid to late 70s and the early 80s in Britain. And by that point, nobody was. People had kind of moved on and kind of they'd found other shibboleths to kind of go after.
Yeah, the early creepies and early eerie's are just they feel very, Tales from the Crypt.
Yeah.
They have that kind of vibe. But especially with Eerie, you get 10 years in, and early, mid 70s, they started actually, like, they had, they had like series. They had Coffin, and
And
some of those like stories were the first ones that I saw, and they scarred me. Just like that. I remember them today. I bought on eBay, and I tracked down an issue. I couldn't remember which one it was, of an Eerie, and I have it, and I've looked at it one time, and I had nightmares for a month because of just some of the imagery in the story. And it's probably a redone story, that's been done over and over and over again. But it's just, some of that stuff is just fascinating. And I think a lot of it has to do, like, with the serial stuff, was with, like, when Heavy Metal magazine was also starting to come around, and they did a similar type thing. They're like, well, we got to kind of capture that serialized vibe in comics. It was just a amazing time to be reading that stuff. It's just, some
yeah,
of those stories were wow.
incredible. You had the amazing Bruce Jones, and you had artists like Bernie Wrightson, who
Mm-hmm.
all cut their teeth. So then you had, like, once they'd kind of run out of EC horror comic artists to kind of like pump for work. Yeah, a new generation of artists started to break in, who had grown up reading the original EC horror comics. And Bruce Jones and Bernie Wrightson, they had the famous story called Jennifer, which also was adapted into one of the Masters of Horror TV series, which is a superb, absolutely excellent story.
Is that the one
And
Argento did?
um, I'm not sure. It might have been.
I think it was Jennifer.
Yeah, and also, actually, kind of just speaking of creepy and eerie, um, the they were edited from the mid to late 70s onwards by a lady called Louise Jones, who later became Louise Simonson when she married Walt Simonson. And actually, Louise and Walt make cameo appearances in the first and second volumes of Draw You In, actually as themselves. Another of the themes of the books is the way that reality and fiction often bleed into each other, particularly in comics and horror comics. As an example, that from a lot of the EC horror comics actually featured the writers and artists as characters in the story. They would appear as characters who were writing the story within the story. And this started a tradition which is carried on quite a lot in comics. In the late 1980s, early 1990s, people like Grant Morrison started appearing in their story, and all kinds of meta activities take place. But also, fiction sometimes bleeds out and into reality itself. The best example of this is the V for Vendetta mask from the story V for Vendetta by Alan Moore and David Lloyd. And the mask designed by David Lloyd was taken up by Anonymous and also by the Occupy Wall Street people, and became a sign of subversion, just as it is in the actual comics. So I wanted to kind of like look at I wanted to mirror that in both the themes and the execution of the novel. So I originally had two characters based on Walt and Louise, who were actually good family friends of ours. But then I thought, why don't I actually have them appear as themselves? So it was a bit of a creative experiment. To go back to the comic writer Grant Morrison that I mentioned before, he spoke about in the future we'll have fiction suits, which are kind of like strange metaphysical devices we'll put on, which allow us to step into our favorite stories and interact with them. And I thought, it's always an idea that's quite fascinated me. So I thought, how can I do that with Walt and Louise? So I actually invited them into the story to be characters. And when I was writing the scenes in which they appear, they wrote all their own actions and all their own dialogue. and actually we wrote it passing it backwards and forwards like a round robin. So they knew, they were very friendly with the main character. They knew as much about her life as they would as a friend, but they didn't know quite what was going on with her and why she was acting in such a strange fashion. But on the other hand, anything they said or did became part of the story. So they stepped into my story and could change it as much or as little as they liked, and I just had to kind of roll with that. So they became real life characters, and they mentioned friends of theirs and stuff that was happening in their life, which then becomes things which happen as part of the fictional world of the novel. And I also, a little bit later on, just before the novel, all three novels were released, I had a bit of a hoax online, where I got a series of quite well-known comic websites and blogs to run a series of strips. I claim to have found a set of unpublished printers proofs for a series of comics amongst a friend of mine who was a big collector. When he passed, I was overlooking his work, and I came across these printers proofs. Most of them were just reprints of previous things, but I came across this strange artist that I'd never encountered, and I printed copies of his work on these websites, asking other collectors and various people who knew things, can you help me track down and look for this character R.L. Carver? And for a little while, I had some genuine comics experts saying, well, it could be this, it could be that, and other people going, no, this is a clever hoax. You've not this right, because this isn't this dot matrix printing that you've actually think. This is done with a screen. You can tell for this reason. There was a big debate going on up to the release of the book. So for a brief while, one of my fictional characters actually had a kind of half-life in the blogosphere as well. And I actually had real-life people searching out and trying to find this character R.L. Carver, just as my fictional characters do throughout the book. So I had a lot of reality bleeding into fiction and fiction bleeding into reality as well.
And so when people found out that the R.L. Carver stunt was in fact a stunt, what kind of reaction did you get? You know, they've put a lot of their time into this, and it's like, it's Jasper.
It usually, most people got it as a joke, thought it was a clever publicity stunt. I got a lot more good coverage than I thought, based on, wow, this is a bit of like genius marketing, and a lot of people were nice about that. Privately, I got a few rude notes from people who said, that was, how effing dare you? This is terrible. It's people like you that are responsible for blah, 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 blah. You name your list of things that are wrong with the world. It was my fault. And I was very apologetic about that. One or two people unfriended me on social media. But most of the response was, what an excellent hoax. That was superb. And I got possibly slightly more coverage for having put on a hoax than I did for actually the original. But it was covered all over Europe as well. It was covered in Italian and German blogs covered it for a little while. So it was a nice little core celeb surrounding the hoax. And most people kind of got it because it was linked to a theme of the novel. So I would just explain, this is the reason I did it. I kind of wanted one of my fictional characters to escape into the real world. And every now and again, people even still stumble upon one of these blogs and drop me a little line saying, do you think R.L. Carver could actually have been this artist? And then I have to go, no, actually, he is a fictional character, but thank you very much.
I don't know, is there a temptation to just continue it going? And, if they aren't aware it's fictional, you're like, oh, yeah, that's an interesting one. Why don't you pour more hours of your life into that and tell me what you uncover?
Sometimes, yeah. But I have to come clean. But then I have to sort of weigh it up against, would you like to buy this book? Would you like to buy this book? I have a wife and 3 very hungry overdrafts to feed. Please buy my book.
And with the engagement and presumably, down the road, imminent marriage, you got those considerations
Oh
as
hell
well.
yeah,
So
yeah, this is true. Well, I'm kind of hoping that one of my children will strike it incredibly rich, so maybe they can look
that's
after
what
me
we
and my
all hope.
dotage.
And by that, I mean with our own children, not everyone in the world is hoping for your children to strike incredibly rich. But if
Yes,
they
let's hope
did,
they
then the power of that could,
hope a
result
bit
in it.
more. Yes, hope, and let's hope I strike it rich. Then I can look after my kids, and I don't need to look after me in my dotage. I can buy a Japanese robot to look after me in my dotage, which is so far is my plan.
So absolutely solid plan. And I mean, goodness, yeah, I was going to bring up the stunt online if you had not done that. But I mean, if we think about conspiracy theories in comics, do you think that it's perhaps the medium where there are more conspiracy theories than any other medium, or do you think it's particularly ripe for having these theories?
That's interesting, isn't it? I think it probably is. Well, I think one of the reasons it is because comics, even though they've been somewhat rehabilitated in the last 20 years, and children's publishers like Scholastic, who have got quite a high reputation, are making a very good living out of publishing graphic novels, it's still seen as a marginal art form. And for most of its existence, apart perhaps from the 30s and 40s when it was very, very mainstream, and apart perhaps from like the 20s and 30s when newspaper strips made like millionaires and huge stars out of their creators, it's never been seen as like a mainstream or a particularly literary medium. It's always been seen as a marginalized art form, and the marginalization of art forms and the marginalization of the people who create them is another theme in the novel. But because it sits there in the margins, I think the people that are drawn to it, on the one hand, are very, very imaginative people, or people who like exercise their imagination in some way, and also they're people who they're drawn to a pursuit or an art form that isn't necessarily mainstream in the way that like sports or fashion or politics would be. So those people are probably somewhat prone to marginalized thinking, like conspiracy theories. And I think conspiracy theories are often they borrow an inordinate amount from Pulp Fiction anyway. I think the problem, we were having a bit of a discussion just before the program started about the fact that the problem with most conspiracy theories is that they there's almost a failure of imagination about them. They recycle the same old tropes and cliches over and over again, unfortunately. And I think we've got to this kind of almost post-truth situation in our 21st century society where we know full well that the official story, the official reasoning, the official history that we're given around most major world events probably isn't the entire truth, if there's any truth there at all. And so this kind of gap, this vacuum that leaves in our public trust is filled very, very quickly with alternate theories about what might happen. But unfortunately, these alternate theories then breed alternate facts, which actually aren't facts at all. They're invention, and they borrow very heavily from the pulp fiction world, which exists within comics itself. So a lot of theories and ideas regarding the world and how it operates within conspiracy theories probably began life first off in the pulps, and particularly the science fiction and the horror pulps, and then the science fiction and horror pulps gave birth to early comics, and again they continue this repository of alternate facts, alternate histories, and so people who are into these things, they're almost kind of like programmed. They've had these kind of archetypes embedded in their consciousness, so that when the world around them stops making any sense, when the facts that we're given don't seem to join up, and when we know that there are greater forces working behind the scenes, and they are working together with each other, effectively conspiring for an agenda which is not the agenda which is being publicly announced, and it's kind of becoming achingly apparent. We try and then almost kind of like decrypt these events and work out what's actually going on behind the scenes. And we've been primed already with all these pulp archetypes, and so we go, obviously there's a giant conspiracy, because the most terrifying thing to think is actually maybe these people who are directly in charge of vast resources, huge amounts of money, and incredible apparatus of the state, maybe they're incompetent. Maybe they actually really don't know what they're doing. Maybe they're less smart than a lot of the average people. That's quite terrifying. So it's nice to think that actually, although they may look really, really stupid, although these things may look to be like almost butt-clenchingly foolish in what they're doing, secretly there is actually a tiny little cabal of incredibly clever, brilliant minds working together behind the scenes to distract us with these like foolish puppets, while there actually is. Dad hasn't actually left the building, and neither has Mom. They really are in charge of things. So take a deep breath, relax. There's not an idiot behind the wheel. We're not charging over the cliff into a complete apocalypse. This is all part of some grand plan, and where one of us goes, we all go. Trust in the plan. Actually, secretly, it's all going on behind the scenes. So relax. And I think I've gone off on a huge tangent about conspiracies, and but from a writer's perspective, I tend to treat these things as just another form of mythology. It's another giant, grand, all-encompassing, perfect explanation of everything. And rather than saying, "Is this true? Is this not true?" It's more fun to say, like, well, there is an element of fiction in what we call mainstream fact and mainstream history, and there's a huge element of fiction behind the theories which perhaps explain the conspiracies that we think are going on behind the scenes. So this is our domain. We're writers, so this is a giant well of like public fiction, which has an inordinate amount of material for us to draw upon and to play with. And it's okay for me to sit here and going, actually, most conspiracy theories bore me because we've all heard the yada, 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 alien greys, back to Atlantis, or it's the Freemasons by way of the Knights Templar. Isn't it more fun to actually take all the ideas and then go, well, why don't we actually, using our creative brains, come up with a better conspiracy theory? A conspiracy theory that explains things much more concisely, that perhaps explains not just the nature of society and history as we know it, but perhaps the entire core components of what makes reality itself. And so as a fiction writer, that's what draws me to conspiracy theories. I'm not necessarily they're right or they're wrong. It's just like, wow, this is a whole extra mythology for us to play with. And it's horror fiction in particular deals with the neuroses, the fears and the anxieties of a society at any given point. And so does conspiracy theory. So why aren't we just like leaping into this pool and drawing on it and actually adding to it? Because we've got better ideas than a lot of the guys on the QAnon sites. So let's bring our own ideas in.
Cultural anthropologist, or excuse me, cultural historian Colin Dickey has written a book. It came out a couple of years ago called "Under the Eye of Power: How Fear and Secret Societies Shaped American Democracy." And reading this book, and it's talking about the history of America and how basically how it's like, hey, Colin's theory is, that we all just talk about conspiracy theories, and maybe you're kind of thinking that's a new thing, and it's not. It's old. It's as old as the United States. And so that got me to thinking that you could take these, like you're talking about, archetypes, and put them over any modern society and watch as conspiracy theories actually develop society. And so it's when you said mythology, bingo, man, that's we have a vast wealth of existing conspiracy theories, and here's the thing, if you get involved in that kind of stuff, it can be really, really dangerous on yourself. But to use it in fiction, I think you should. I think you should explore that, and also have the I guess the gumption to go, hey, you know what? Then sometimes just weird shit happens. So yeah.
Yeah, the thing is, I think we don't include enough in conspiracy the general confusion. It's like we've reached the point at which we'll probably never ever find the smoking gun and find out who directly killed President Kennedy, unless you actually believe in the official version. In which case, I'm not going to argue with you. But if you don't believe in the official version, the thing is, I actually even think the person who shot the bullet, which actually went through Jack Kennedy's head, even they are not 100% certain that it was them. I think sometimes like stuff just happens and no one can explain. And one of the reasons the authorities like leap in and cover the whole thing up is because they don't have an explanation. They don't know why. They don't want to be caught with their pants down and go on the 10 o'clock news and go, well, we haven't got a clue what happened. Who shot him and why he shot him and why he did that. So they'll just shut the whole thing down and find a culprit because that maintains their power structure and their standing and their authority. But to admit, well, we kind of don't know. It could have been this guy. It could have been that guy. There were 20 different guys thinking about shooting him, and we were having conversations. We don't know. And I'm pretty certain the guy who shot Kennedy, even they don't know that they did it. If they arrested the right guy, I mean, he would probably be on the news saying, "And I'm just a patsy. It wasn't me." Which is perhaps why Lee Harvey Oswald, maybe he even did it, but he just wasn't aware. There are any number of people probably hanging around grassy knolls and book depositories taking pot shots at the president, probably 20 of them, just for the simple fact that somebody had to have done it. But if there was enough people who could have been potential candidates for it, then everybody is ultimately deniable and therefore covered. Just
There's so many things.
Yeah.
There's so many things I could say about the current situation.
This is
but
true.
I think because it's so prescient and because, conspiracy theories are perhaps more at the forefront of the collective zeitgeist than they have ever been, that's what makes this book, amongst other things, so successful. So even though it is unapologetically a love letter to horror comics, you could read this with absolutely no knowledge of horror comics and get a hell of a lot out of it. And I mean, even before we get deep into the conspiracy theory, just that hook, just that way that I was drawn in from the start with this simple idea that someone could disappear from everyone's memory but your own. I mean, how can you not be excited by that? That's just this kind of intense paranoia, this questioning yourself. And, well, hang on, either the whole world has gone mad or I've gone mad. And that's just such a kind of ripe area for exploration, particularly within horror fiction.
Thank you. It's almost like a classic like Twilight Zone episode. Those always start with a really really simple thing happens. One person suddenly steps through the wrong door or turns around the wrong corner, and reality goes in one direction and they go in another, and they're the only person who seems to have spotted this has happened, who's taken a peek behind the curtain of reality. And suddenly they find themselves ostracized from the rest of the world, which is a fear that we all have. What if all of a sudden consensus reality changes? Everybody goes off in one direction like a giant Mandela effect, and only I remember. And that was, and it kind of almost, as I was saying, it kind of goes through different types of genres. It sort of starts as almost like a piece of quiet horror. There's nothing like horrific, and it's a strange psychological situation this character goes through, and they have had problems in the past, which is explored in more depth later on as to why they have had mental health problems, and this is brought up and used against them early on as well. This is the artist Linda, who's our main protagonist. So there was a psychological element behind it as well. But it is kind of like, it does start like a classic Twilight Zone story. It's just that it's I also quite like the idea of having like a story that went through a whole load of different genres, in the same way that if you pick up a really good compendium of horror stories, a really good anthology, you'll have all different types of horror fiction throughout each individual stories as you read through the book. Well, wouldn't it be kind of cool if you had one cohesive story that had an incredibly strong through line, took the characters through all sorts of different situations, but at the same time changed genres. I mean, throughout most of the novels go through about 3 different subgenre changes over the course of the individual story. But I'm hoping that you kind of won't notice the changes, or it won't be too jarring, because the story does have a very cohesive through line as well. You could say I was being very ambitious with this. One step away every point, I think, in the all 3 novels from like absolute complete disaster and total failure. But I might have just managed not to do that, I think.
No, I was trying to figure out a way to comp them, and it's like the only thing that comes to mind to me, and I'm not a big fan of either one of these, but I'm a major fan of the second one. It's like either National Treasure or the Da Vinci Code meets In the Mouth of Madness in the world of horror comics. Because I have this. Have you read R.L. Carver? And so have you read Sutter Kane? I have this whole kind of, it has this vibe to it that's just, and then In the Mouth of Madness kind of features like several different types of genre of horror. I mean, there's the body horror, there's cosmic horror, there's psychological horror. There's Sam Neill horror. I don't know how you would put it. It's just like Sam Neill. Sam Neill brings his own game to it. It's like, but yeah, then you have this kind of globe trotting, or kind of going through the United States, and has this kind of national treasure feel. You kind of feel like every other scene, like some guy like Nicolas Cage is going to show up, going, "Well, it's actually the Declaration of Independence,"
Yeah, and there in the second volume, it kind of does. I was very purposely riffing off all those types of books, because they go to Harvard, and look at the secret history of Harvard and how that all kind of links into the secret history of the United States. But they do go on a kind of like a scavenger hunt. And they're taken on a scavenger hunt by this secret cabal they've discovered, through who is connected to R.L. Carver, and so the remit of their investigation starts broadening at this point. They did. And by the way, every single place they go to in the Harvard campus and throughout Boston does actually exist. And all of those weird little bits of history that I picked out, they're all true. Just as actually, every single diner and road they go down and building they actually go into also exists. Some of those streets I've actually walked down myself. And if I haven't actually physically been there, I have actually walked down all of those streets on like Google Maps, and I have even like gone to every single TripAdvisor and Booking.com review of every single one of the diners and the kind of eateries that they stop in on this whole road trip. So geographically, you could, if you wanted to, actually map this across the states. And at one point, they join up all the different places they've been to and find it draws a whole magical symbol, which I've also drawn up as well. And it does fit perfectly across the map of the United States. And in a kind of weird, bizarre way, I'm sure that actually this magical symbol as well explains reality as we know it. This unfortunately completely defies me. I need some completely mad visionary to explain this to me. But it will work, honestly. So read the book. draw the symbol, and the secrets to the cosmos will be yours. I promise you.
So, Draw You In is 3 books, although I believe that it originally was going to be 1. So, I wonder at what point did you realize this book was going to be much longer than you'd anticipated? And also, what is the final word count and how does that break up for each book?
The final word count is just under 300,000. Um, kind of like words. I think it works out at roughly something about 85, and then 120k words per book. And it was getting towards the end of the first draft when it seemed I was going through a period as a writer where at the beginning of my career, I think I mentioned I was a bit of a hack, and I was grinding out comics and then later on novels for shared franchises and for existing franchises, everything from Saturday morning cartoons to video game worlds. And you had to kind of write those absolutely 100% to a word count. And I became very good at doing that. And then when I began to do my own stuff and kind of let my mind expand a little bit and create my own universes and my own franchises, I became increasingly unable to keep to a word count. I thought it was going to be 100 to 120k. That's why I pitched it to my publisher as. And when I got to the end of the first draft, it was kind of getting close to about 170, 180k. And I also realized it was one of those books that you get to the end of the first draft and you realize all the things that you should have put in the first draft. You've been keeping notes and you realize actually it's the story is actually way longer even than the first draft that you've got. And at that point, I had to go back to Crystal Lake and say, this book's not only going to be a little bit later than I originally promised you, so could we revise your publishing schedules? But it's not going to be 1 book, it's going to be 3. I realized at that point to do all the things I needed it to do and to cover all the ground I needed it to cover, it was going to have to be 3 books. And because Crystal Lake are such an amazing publisher, such a great people to work for, Joe Meinhardt, the then editor-in-chief, now kind of like general head honcho and publisher, was a total sweetheart. He pulled it from the existing schedules. He revised the schedules and he gave me like an extra year and a bit to rewrite the whole thing again from scratch as 3 books. And even gave me a new contract, which is not common in publishing, but it happened to be very fabulous people to work for. So yeah, at that point, I think it was just one of these stories. It was a bit like in those old hoary 1950s movies where they get like a tiny piece of plankton or a single amoeba like in a petri dish, and then they irradiate it, and the amoeba just keeps growing and growing and growing till eventually it takes over the entire city of Washington. and you know, or kind of part of the whole eastern seaboard is now just one giant massive unicellular being. I was kind of experiencing that in most of the things that I wrote around about that time. I'd sit down to write a 5k short story. It ended up being a novella, and it just wouldn't stop growing. And this story seems to have been the apotheosis of that moment. I wanted to write 1 book, and it ended up being 3. For those of you who aren't listening at home, I'm holding up all 3 books to kind of just as a kind of piece of absolutely egregious product placement. In case at this point we hadn't worked out, I'm desperate to sell these books and dig my way out of the debt that comes, unfortunately, with working full-time as a writer.
And I think it's very important to emphasize too that these are 3 books rather than 3 novels, in the sense that the story is incomplete until you get to the final one. So very much a kind of risky move for traditional book publishing, but also very apropos when you're essentially writing a comic. And I mean, we all know the phrase "a wolf in sheep's clothing," but I can't decide, is this a novel in comic clothing or is this a comic in novels clothing?
It might be slightly the latter, because the works of R.L. Carver, there is a sentient comic in the actual storyline itself, and I had to replicate the comic strip page as a work of prose. I did that effectively, kind of by using the concept of a comic script. So certain passages in the novel, when we actually deal with what's happening in a comic strip, are kind of like a prose adaptation of what comic strip looks like, and it is a way of putting a comic strip on a page without any pictures. So you provide the pictures. So it's not dissimilar. Certain sections of the book could potentially be handed to an imaginative comic artist, and he could draw a thing from it. So I was kind of marrying a lot of different mediums together, and one of those is marrying the very visual medium of a comic script, which isn't that dissimilar in some ways to a screenplay, and bringing that to life on a page as a piece of prose. So hopefully, when you're reading, in the same way that often most people visualize the events they're seeing on a page, almost as a little movie which plays in our mind. At certain points, though, I want you to kind of see it either as an animatic or directly as a comic strip page. So you'll be reading a piece of prose, but hopefully in your mind you will have like a comic page or a comic strip running in your mind.
Yeah, and those kind of sentient comics, I mean, there's so much. I'm trying to think, how do I actually talk about this without spoiling it? But it is so satisfying to read because those sentient comics have a great sense of right and wrong. And let's say that characters that you think are completely abhorrent, and you're like, something has to happen to them. Oh, that comic will provide. So that, I mean, they're in many ways some of the most satisfying passages from the entire 3 books.
Thank you. Yeah, because each book has a to go back to the whole one of the ways that this developed into the book. I started like with the kind of Herbert model, as I mentioned in the previous episode. And one of the ways this eventually manifested itself was through the draw you interludes. And this was a technique I borrowed from a writer who's really fallen out of favor now, the comic writer and novelist Neil Gaiman. Not making any defense of his actions, but I did borrow a literary conceit he has in many of his stories. He stops the action midway through the story and has a little short story within the story which sums up all the themes of the larger story. And effectively, I was doing that with 3 interludes, the draw you interludes, which is where I kind of play with the comic idea. Each one of those stories is an homage to. There is a story within a story, and there's a dialogue between the exterior story and the interior story. So although this story stops and is a story within a story, there's a story within a story within the story, and the two have a dialogue, and eventually end up eating each other. Quite literally, this will all make sense when you read the book. And also, as you mentioned, I was addressing social themes which are very unfortunately prevalent within the world of comics. I mentioned Neil Gaiman for his sexual predatory behavior. This book came out before all this came to light, but actually that was one of the themes that I actually address in the Draw You interludes. Unfortunately, there have been a lot of very high-profile comic creators, and Neil isn't the only one, who have acted very, very poorly in a very sexually predatory manner. And so that was one of the themes I wanted to address. There's also kind of like copyright theft, the way that many of these creatives have created multi-billion-dollar IPs and profited in no way whatsoever at all. And in some cases have had these illegally stolen from them on the most like flimsy of conceits, but because it's one individual who spent their entire life living a hand-to-mouth existence as a creative up against a multi-billion-dollar corporation, they've never retained or retrieved the rights to these IPs, which are still making billions of dollars to people. That was another issue. And also there was an issue called Comicsgate, where there were a lot of intensely dislikable individuals who were trolling any female or minority individual who works within comics. These were kind of behaviors I didn't like. So I kind of addressed them as a horror comic would address them. And one thing about the EC horror comics, and in fact, even things like Creepshow, which again was an anthology horror movie based around a horror comic. So that will be another like touchstone for draw you in. King did say that Creepshow comics are moral comics, and there is a big, strong moral contingent. Although there's a big Conti cruel going on, a character does something absolutely horrible and then gets a very satisfying comeuppance at the end of it. And usually and so I use those kind of conceits to address those social themes. But also, each one of the stories is an homage to a classic horror story. There's the Yellow Wallpaper is one that there's the by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. There's the Incident Owl Creek Bridge by Ambrose Bierce, and there's also the Telltale Heart. Those are some of my favorite classic horror stories. And also horror comics have traditionally ripped off either literary or pulp source material and wholesale stolen stories from them and kind of dusted them off and presented them. Famously, Ray Bradbury, noticing that EC Horror Comics had actually stolen a couple of his ideas, wrote to them and said, I think you might have overlooked to actually pay me for those stories of mine that you used. And because he did it in a very cool, extremely nice way, they kind of like fessed up and went, yeah, sorry. And from there on in, they actually paid him a little bit and actually directly said they were borrowing his stories. Years later, that somebody, the writer Bill Mantlo, stole Harlan Ellison's script for the Outer Limits story, A Demon with a Glass Hand, and actually did that exact same story in I think it was in either a Hulk comic. And again, Harlan Ellison found him up and went, hang on a effing minute. That's my story. And Jim Shooter at the time went, yeah, Harlan, it is. I'm terribly sorry. Please don't sue us. And Harlan, being an absolute sweetheart, went, no, I won't sue you. I just want you, A, to every single time that's reprinted from now on in, I want you to actually say it's my story that you stole. And B, I want you to send me a copy of every single comic that you print for free, which they did for the rest of his life. So there was kind of a history of. So I took these stories which were in the public domain, and I don't steal the plot. I actually riff off it as well in those draw you interludes, which are also the interludes which, as we mentioned, replicate the comics medium in a prose form. And hopefully, if you're listening to this and you haven't read the book, you'll be going, this sounds interesting. This has piqued my interest and I'm somewhat intrigued. So do be intrigued and do go and check these out.
Yeah, and in telling us the reaction from Ray Bradbury, I thought, yeah, that sounds about right. But when you mentioned Harlan Ellison, I thought, oh, did somebody end up dead? That was a very restrained reaction from at least kind of the legend and the mythos of Harlan Ellison.
He could be a sweetheart as well, apparently. And Jim Shooter, they had him to bang to rights. Unfortunately, Bill Mantlo, the writer, was guilty of plagiarism a few times in his career. And the only reason apparently he didn't get the sack was because he had friends kind of higher up in the Marvel hierarchy. Jim Shooter wanted to sack him and never use him again, but he had friends upstairs, above Jim Shooter's pay grade, who said, "No, we're going to keep him." And Harlan was a sweetheart, and Harlan was a big comics fan, which is why he'd found out they'd stolen his story. And the idea of getting free Marvel comics for the rest of your life.
He used it to his advantage.
Yeah, I mean, add up all of those kind of like just in a single year, he's going to get paid way more than they would have paid him just for a single script. So,
Yeah. I mean, I think we've all seen the video of Harlan talking about how they wanted him to do something for for one of the series of I think it was Babylon 5 or something like that he wrote on or something like that. It's like, hey, yeah, we want you to do for the DVD, da 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 da. Can you write up something? And he was like, yeah, sure, pay me. And they're like, well, we were hoping you could do it for free. And he's like, for free? Fuck you. Yeah. I'm not doing it for fucking free. I'm a writer. You pay me. You pay the guy who did the shit, right? Yeah, you're going to pay me, And they're like, oh, well, we're not going to do anything. He goes, yeah. He goes, always get paid. That's what you do, And so I'm surprised that, that he was a sweetheart, but they probably he probably called him out on it. They're like, yeah. And then he saw a way that he could go, I can get fucking free comics for life on this shit. You're going to send me a copy of every single comic that you put out for the rest of my life. I'm going to put it in the storage bin. It's like, fuck yeah, I'd be in on that shit.
yeah, I would too. Not that I want anyone in Marvel Comics to rip me off, because I don't think I quite have the clout on this.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, again, we said before that, this can appeal to people who don't really have an interest in the comics world because of how universal these themes are, and possibly the most affecting of these kind of interludes is the one to do with intellectual property and, let's say, a company trying to get rights that they meant to have and then realize that they didn't have. And it's shocking, it's corrupt, but it's unfortunately so relatable to nearly any big industry with massive corporations.
Yeah.
What happens is, to use words like abhorrent is really understating it.
Yeah, this is true. And thank you for saying that it also people who don't like comics. About half the reviews on Goodreads on Amazon are along the lines of people like, well, I don't read graphic novels and I don't read comics, but I was quite surprised to find this was very, very interesting to me. So that historic backdrop is an historic backdrop. It's something that isn't always covered in fiction. It's a new take, a new little world for you to explore. You don't have to have like giant long boxes full of mylar bagged comics in order to enjoy this. But yeah, that particular section as well was also based on again experiences of friends and colleagues who've run into trouble, and people who did own the rights to IPs, who did go up against large corporations, and they are prepared to act in terrible ways. This is a horror comic. This is a horror story, excuse me, not a horror comic, about horror comics. So I can kind of exaggerate a tiny little bit. People act just a little bit more horrifically, I hope, than they would in real life. But yeah, I've heard, if you work in the industry for any length of time, you hear some intense horror stories about people's experience. And it is one of the reasons I actually invent a third. In the world of comics, there are, like in American comics, there are two big publishers. There's DC and Marvel, which are now owned by much larger conglomerates. But there's kind of like a binary thing here. But in order to speak about some of these shenanigans without getting into territory where I could be sued, I invented a third company called Fox Comics. Or rather, I didn't invent them. I invented an alternate history where Fox, which used to be like the big rival to Timely, which was what Marvel was before it became Marvel, and National Periodicals, which is what DC was before it became DC. There was a third company called Fox Comics. It was actually founded by the owner of, rather the accountant for Jack Leibovitz and Harry Donenfeld, who ran National Periodicals, which became DC Comics. And he saw how much money they were making, and he went and set up his own comics publishing company to rip them off. And they were extant until the late 1950s when they went out of business. And in my alternate fictional world, they carry on and become like the third underdog, effectively. So there's three big publishers, but that was a way for me to actually write about what it's like working as a creative for these large corporations. And like one of the things you have to do, which always kind of chafes with you, is you work on a work for hire basis. So they pay you a big load of money up front for this, but you sign away all the rights, and you get like contracts which are like 20, 30 pages. And you should always read your contracts, even if you don't necessarily know what everything means, and you should Google all the terms. But at one point, there are several clauses which you can't get out of and can't cross out, where you sign away the moral rights to all of your creations in order to work for this company. And I've signed a lot of these contracts over the course of my career as a writer, and it always feels like an immoral act to sign away my moral rights. It's not something I've done in the last decade or so, but it always stuck in my throat, and the editor would always have to chase me because I'd always like hover over the pen for about a week before I first posted back when I was first working as a comics writer, and then eventually scanned and sent it back in the last days of my work for hire in the fiction mines. And I guess some of that moral repugnance that I felt spills over and comes out in these books, because we shouldn't have to do that in order just to kind of make the money to pay my mortgage and keep feeding my kids.
I think there's a real problem with contracts in not only publishing, but in wider industries. And I mean, anytime when you challenge a contract, you run the risk of just the whole deal is off. I mean, so I'll start with publishing, and then I'll get into the English language teaching in Japan industry. Yeah, that's right. All the employers that have been waiting for 10 years for me to finally dig some dirt, presumably listening to every This Is Horror podcast. That's where we're going. Today is the day. But in publishing, I've had times where I've nearly got a deal done, and then I've sent it to my lawyer to have a look at, and he's been like, look, you've got to get these clauses removed. Usually it's a clause that says like, okay, if anything goes wrong and we have legal action taken against us, you will pay not only for your own lawyer, but you will pay for ours as well. That's happened a number of times, specifically in audiobook contracts. And, it's things that even if it happens and it's out of my control, and it's like, look, you can't sign that. So I've had times where I've lost like thousands of pounds because the audiobook just couldn't happen. And they're like, but if I sign it, and then something happens, and I'm going to be tens or possibly hundreds of thousands of pounds in debt. So we know that there's a minor chance of something happening, but you can't predict what somebody could falsely claim is the issue here. And then with the English language teaching industry in Japan, like, I've noticed increasingly that they're adding clauses in that just make me feel a little bit uncomfortable. So one of them is that, like, basically at any time when you're teaching, the company could video or photograph you and then use that in their own promotional material. Well, kind of as somebody who's gone through a lot of contracts in publishing, it's like, well, hang on a minute, now this is extra work. So if you're using me to do a promo for your company, I should be paid. I should be paid more. That is an additional duty beyond teaching. But I mean, the reality is there's enough people that will just sign it. So if I question it and I say, can we remove that? There's no job. So if you want the job, you have to sign it anyway, even though you kind of know that what they're doing is completely wrong. And
Uh,
the problem as well is often these jobs where they have these clauses in, the people taking them, they're not rich enough to be able to take a moral stance. I can't say, oh, I'm not going to do that, and now I have no money and everyone's starving and now I'm dead.
yeah, that's how. I mean, I'm talking about like wrangling about signing these work for hire contracts. Yeah, I signed a lot because the choice was: do I do something creative that's incredibly close to what I want to do with my life, and manage to pay all my bills, and fulfill my financial responsibilities as a husband and a father, or do I take a moral stance? And then every time it did stick in my throat. And I occasionally you can question stuff, but sometimes you do need collective action. I've worked on publications like anthology publications where I've reached out to my fellow like creatives and said, "There's this clause in our contract. This is wrong. If we all say no, we can renegotiate that." And some sneaky little shitbag has gone back to the creator going, "He's been paying this behind your back." And then suddenly every single creative, rather than starting with me, is like, run for cover. Oh, no, I wasn't going to do that. And I found myself exposed going, well, and they're going, well, nobody else wants to sign it. And what are you doing getting in touch with a fellow creative who shouldn't be bothering them? And I've had other things as well. Sometimes when I've challenged stuff and the publishers have backed down and gone, oh, yeah, sorry, you're right. Such as clauses like saying, well, we can, if we like, put this out under any name we want. And you will have to morally stand up in a court and say so if we call upon you. And I'm going, I can't sign this. Don't be stupid. And they've gone, oh, yeah, sorry. Our lawyer put that in there. He's a little bit too overeager. We'll just take that out. When they're questioned and challenged, and when I have slightly, better grounds to challenge them on. So yeah, contracts, difficult, annoying, irritating things. I have to say, the publishers I'm working with at the moment, all the various different publishers, are far more ethical than that. And that's all these difficulties we're talking about. And this is somewhat, we're going off on a bit of a tangent. Although it did come up because obviously I addressed these issues a little bit in the novels, but this is one of the reasons why, aside from the big tentpole authors that all publishers are chasing, the James Pattersons, the J.K. Rowlings, the Stephen Kings. The only other people who are making any real decent money at publishing are the people who are now self-publishing. And it's why most professional authors have, at the very least, a portfolio. They have things they publish themselves. They have things they publish with really good independent publishers who treat them properly and ethically. And then occasionally we still go and dance with the devil or the big mainstream where there's a contract full of clauses that you have to argue with if your agent doesn't argue it for you.
Yeah, and I should say, most publishers, when I have raised things, they don't drop you or withdraw the contract immediately. And I think, definitely we have a right and almost a responsibility if we think something is wrong or a little bit off to question it.
Mm.
It'll usually be that things break down after 5 or 6 times of going back and forth. And so sometimes you have to decide, okay, what is there anything that I can compromise here? Because if you raise, let's say, 10 points in the contract, then probably 5 of them they'll automatically readjust to begin with.
Yeah.
Maybe from back and forth, you can get a further 3 whittled down. And then it's like, look, these two,
I'm going to have to live with.
they have to stay. So do you want the money and to sign a little bit of your soul away? Or do you not want the money and you feel very good until
That's a
you
good,
get ill because you're
yeah.
malnourished? And
That's a good tactic, and also it's kind of worthwhile, kind of like saying that that there's a degree of compromise in every business. I was having a conversation with another creative earlier today, actually, a good friend of the friend that I lost. And we were kind of saying that in every job, no matter what you do for a living, all this bollocks about do something you love, you never work a day in your life. But that there's a great deal of dog shit. I mean that because 60% of every job, no matter what you do, involves drudgery. We're talking about publishing and being a professional author. People seem to think that's a dream job where you just sit in some ivory tower and dream all day. There's a vast amount of like drudgery. There's a huge number of stuff, pitches you write which never get written, emails that you have to do. Every single job comes with a vast amount of admin and things you don't want to do because it's a job, because it's making you money. It's not a hobby. Once the money gets involved, there's crap you have to go and sit with your accountant. You have to do project loss. You have to do your tax return. You have to chase people to do things for you. And okay, 40% of your job, that's the bit that actually creates the kind of value. That you may or may not enjoy doing that. And if you're in a creative profession, there's various different degrees of enjoying that and not enjoying that. Invariably, you're only doing it because you can't do anything else with your life because you're that socially inadequate. And then there's the 60% of it's a job. And everybody has this it's a job element of their of whatever profession you go into. And which hence is why we've kind of sat here for the last however many minutes, 10, 12 minutes, bitching about effing contracts on a This Is Horror podcast. And friends listening at home, this is the most horrific thing about writing horror professionally. The effing contracts.
Well, it is horror, but I thought it was important to bring it back and to clarify that point too, because what I didn't want is for people to hear like, you question things and you lose your contract, whereas the opposite should be no, do question things, because as you said before, if enough people do, then suddenly these kind of intolerable clauses would have to, by the nature, be removed. But something you mentioned is, broadly speaking, these days people seem to make more via independently or self-publishing, and it's a very, very difficult one that a lot of people are grappling with at the moment. It's something we've mentioned before on This Is Horror before, because if you put something independently out, if you self-publish it, then you will take a much greater percentage of every sale. That is inarguable. But to have like a massive platform to get the exposure, to get the marketing, you kind of mostly need a bigger publisher anyway. There are exceptions to everything. So this is why I think the hybrid model, where people do a little bit of indie, a little bit of trad, is increasingly becoming the norm, because to 100% of nothing is still nothing. So
Yep.
I mean, for me, I'm at a relatively early stage in my career, so I'm kind of doing this dance at the moment where I think if I could land with a bigger publisher, that would be ideal to kind of get that reach, at least initially. And then, I could pick and choose what's going to be independent and what's going to be with a mainstream publisher. And, you look at when these bigger publishers put something out, quite often you go to the Goodreads page, the book's not even out yet. It's got hundreds, if not thousands, of reviews. I can't do that as somebody self-publishing. I don't have that reach, and I unfortunately don't have that budget.
Unfortunately, the corollary of that is that sometimes you put things out with a really big publisher, and a year later you go to your Goodreads page and you've got half the number of reviews of somebody who's self-published entirely. Just because you're with a mainstream publisher, they have a very limited budget and a very limited window in their kind of like marketing schedule when they're going to push your book. And once that's done, goodbye. And that can be a tiny budget and a tiny amount of time that they'll actually spend trying to promote your book. And then they've got another book coming out next week, and they've got to do all the marketing for that. And there's only 2 people in that department, and they're massively underfunded. Anyway, so unless your book is a surprise hit, you get a tiny little bit of time for them to push it, even if you're with a huge F-off publisher, because the huge F-off publishers are only really putting money into. They'll choose like one book from a new publisher, a new artist, author that they think might do one that they'd like to promote, and then they've got their tentpole guys, which is where most of their budget is going, and everybody else that they publish is just a crapshoot. That might take off, it might not. Who knows?
Mm-hmm. It's really kind of weird, because if you look at like the big publishers and stuff like that, and the things that get noticed, it is a total crapshoot. You could sit there and you could spend 5 to 6 years of your life working on a novel, submitting it, getting an agent, getting them to find, getting a big 4, big 5 publisher to pick it up. They put a marketing plan together, put you on a book tour and everything like that. And then you get nothing. And when you're reading, you get on social media, and some no talent influencer who talks to snails is getting a movie deal, and you're like going, "What the fuck have I just fucking done with my life?" You should be happy that you wrote a book.
Yeah.
And you got it published by a big 5 publisher, and you need to be working on the next thing, because there's a possibility that there's some person who works in the movies who read your book that really didn't go anywhere. It's like going, I want to make this into a movie. Who do I talk to make this into a movie? I want to make this into a movie, and it could be somebody big. It could be, I don't know, Ryan Coogler. I don't know. It could be anybody. It could be anyone. And then you're like, next thing you know, you're like, yes. I mean, think about it. It took a while for someone to make The Ritual into a movie, but they did.
Yeah, but also,
and now Adam Neville is like, yeah, he's got actually a couple movies out. Yay.
Yeah. But you don't actually get, also, it's not often a life-changing amount of money. It's like some people,
right,
they get a life-changing amount of money for their first advance. The rest of us, get like a 6-figure, or not, sorry, not a 6-figure. The rest of us get like about a 4-figure fee as an advance from a big publisher. And even if it gets picked up or optioned, only money you're going to make is in the option fee. You'll be offered lots of things at the back end, which will never happen. And it isn't a life-changing amount of money. It's a nice amount of money. It's an incredibly fabulous holiday. It's a new car, or you can build an extension on your house, but you're not unfortunately going to retire on it. It's a third of an average annual wage is roughly what most authors get from an option. Even from
what you got to look at, if you get a 6-figure deal, what a lot of people don't realize is that it's like you're getting a 6-figure advance. You're not going to get 6 figures at one time. They're going to break that up into multiple payments. Don't quit your day job because you're
whose careers have ended because they've been given a huge advance from a publisher, and the book hasn't done as well as it's thought. And from there on because publishing is a small industry, they become the writer got the big advance and did not even if it was
Didn't earn out.
yeah. So that kind of like sits against on your kind of balance sheet professionally for the rest of your life. And sometimes that's it. No other publisher will go near you because you had that giant liability. You cost this big name publisher way loads of money. And that's one of the things that happened to George R. Martin. I mean, it's happened to friends of mine. But I mean, George R. Martin, his career effectively stopped after the Armageddon rag, which didn't do anywhere as well as his publisher thought. And he had to spend like 20 years working in TV before a publisher would pick him up again and start publishing. And luckily, he wrote Game of Thrones, and the rest was history. But for the rest of us, that could seriously go against your career if you don't make back that advance.
Right.
And if it's a recoupable advance, you're in an even worse situation, particularly if you spend the money. Just say, by a recoupable advance, a non-recoupable advance means they just give you money and you run off to the bank with it. A recoupable advance means they'll give you the money, but if it doesn't make that back in sales, they can effectively come back and take that money back off you.
Yeah, I think the George R. Martin story as well is a story in persistence and grit and just absolute resolution
and pure luck, and it's when pure luck meets great talent.
Right.
Because
Yeah.
he is an amazing writer, and he was just really seriously lucky. Which is kind of the secret. It's always, you kind of go on author panels, and one of the questions that many people want to ask them is, how did you get this big success? And they always come up with like all sorts of, well, I just kind of worked really very, very hard, or I decided to follow my dream. I started to stop messing about, write the things I wanted to write. And actually they're all talking out their backsides, bless them, because what they don't want to say is, I've got no clue. It was sheer, absolute, massive dumb luck. I wrote 3 books, was tanked, and my 4th book, for some amazing reasons, sold incredibly well.
Yeah. I mean, the only thing I'd add to that is the harder that you work, the more chance you have of getting lucky.
Yeah,
If you stop, if you give up because it didn't work out, well, then it's definitely not going to work out. But if you keep writing, every time you write a novel, I think of it as a ticket to win the lottery.
yeah,
So if you keep writing, if you keep buying these tickets, you might get lucky, but equally, it might never happen. So that's why, I say if you can find joy in the pursuit of writing itself, you win every time. And I
yeah.
think really you have to do that because
That's
there's
the
no
key thing.
guaranteed financial success. So you might as well at least have fun doing it.
Yeah, I could not agree more. The reason for writing a book is not to like retire or make loads of money. It's because you really desperately wanted to see that story in print or upon a big screen. It haunted you, and you had to get out of your system, and you had to do this thing, and this brought you joy. And if you simply get down the story in the way that you want it in words, that makes you a successful writer, and that's all that makes a successful writer. If you then get that story down in words the way you want it to into print, and people begin to read it and discuss it, that's a doubly successful person, even if it's a tiny minority of people. And that should be why you're doing it, because at certain points in your life, a particular given story or a book that you read either changed your world or saved your life or just brought so much pleasure to you, and enhanced your existence, that you want to pay that forward. You want to write that book that for one other person or for a large group of people had that exact same effect on them, so that they will want to, if they have a literary bent, write their own books, which they will then pay forward. And that's the success around writing. Whether or not you make lots of money out of it is a matter of luck and business sense. There is an equation which preparation plus opportunity equals luck. So, and that's like the business side of it. But like how much money you spend or how many books you sell is not necessarily a reflection of how successful you are as a writer, in the kind of like broad scale of things, other than that means you're successful within the business of publishing. And everybody aspires, I think, who publishes professionally to have some success on that grounds. But that shouldn't be the reason you sit down to write. You sit down to write because you have something to say. You have a need to communicate, and you have a love of fiction and the written word if you want to be a fiction writer, to such a degree that you're compelled to write these things and to connect with other people, and that you want to create work that will connect with other people, irrespective of your audience size.
And so we've spoke quite a lot throughout the course of this conversation about, the business of writing. It's kind of split into the pure joy of writing the story itself, and then the actual practical business parts that may or may not result in some sort of money. So I want to know, what are you doing in terms of the non-writing or the writing tangential activities, and then how much of, let's say, a given week or a given month is dedicated to that, and how much does it differ based on whether you have or haven't had a book that's just come out?
Oh, yeah, it is about 50-60% of my time is caught up in things like publicity and marketing, which involves everything from social media to running a newsletter to any online presence that you have. But on top of that, you're also appearing at conventions and other gatherings, and sometimes putting your book into people's hands. So it's kind of a lot of being a professional author is a little bit like being one of those people who make artisan goods and have a website and sell them on a website, and go to craft fairs and sell them at craft fairs. That's effectively the business model that most authors follow. So I turn up at conventions and I have like the smallest little table that I can effectively afford, and I have to sell X amount of books to pay for my hotel room and the price of ordering the table, and then anything else is hopefully profit. But also it's a profile raising. I spend time doing a lot of press and interviews like this one, where I'm selling a book, subliminally buy this book. And on top of that, I'm when I got into publishing about 25 years ago, the key thing that you needed was a contact book. You needed to know people in the profession. It was all about who you knew. So your job was to know people. So you networked like a mother, in any possible availability. But it was contacts within the profession. That was like your big asset that you could leverage. These days, actually, it's kind of the reverse. It doesn't really matter who you know within the publishing industry. What you need is to demonstrate a certain readership. So you spend a lot of time engaging with people through whatever platform, whether that's meeting them at conventions, whether it's spending a lot of time on whichever social media platforms work for you, writing a blog, updating your website, keeping your mailing list going, doing videos. That's all about engaging with people and building an audience, and that involves engaging with the people who read your work, or who might read your work, who've been meaning to read your work for the past 3 years and just need one tiny last little prod to get them to go and buy your entire back catalogue. So that kind of is, and on top of that, obviously there's all the business with corresponding with the various people who publish and sell your work, and when I work with independent publishers, or the odd occasions when I take full control of the process myself, and get involved in publishing it myself, then you've got to do all the other business things, from getting an ISBN number to commissioning artwork, and a lot of the publishers now I have to because I've also worked as a professional copywriter, I have to write my own book blurb. I get quite heavily involved in like the covers and the cover image and working with the artist, and blah 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 blah, all of that. So that involves a vast amount of emails and admin and engagement, talking to other people, which is like just like a part of anybody else's job. If you were working in retail, you'd be doing that, standing behind a counter talking to people, and then you'd be doing your invoicing afterwards and your stock taking, and that's kind of what I have to do. It is that's like the job element of doing this as professionally.
Yeah, I tend to find that the job is having multiple jobs at once. I mean, if you look at a lot of other jobs, I mean, if you're an accountant, you are an accountant. That is the job. If you're a lawyer, you're a lawyer. But increasingly these days, and it depends which publisher you're with, but I mean, if you were just self-publishing, then you are the writer, you are the advertiser, you are the marketer, you are the accountant. You might be the lawyer to some point. Depends how much experience and money you have as to how much of that you deal with. And as has often been said, even if you're with the most kind of resourceful, richest publisher, you're at a very minimum, as well as the writer, kind of the promoter. You're doing the publicity.
Yeah.
Because the publicity too, that's not like, they can't get a stand-in for you. I mean, there's an argument sometimes with political leaders that they do, or their partners have a stand-in, not to name anyone, but as the author, you can't get the other Jasper Bark, or at least that's what we think. One convention we're gonna see, it's John Bark. Here he is, the identical twin, the crazier brother. Jasper was a madman. You ain't met John yet. Good God. Absolute nutter.
Reminds me of Gallagher. You know the comedian Gallagher, the Smash-O-Matic and all that. He had a brother who did the same thing.
Wow, really?
Yes, he really did. I think there was, if I remember correctly, and I may be misremembering this part, but I believe that they sued each other. So that's some crazy shit.
Yeah, well,
I think Michael's looking it up right now.
No.
No.
Oh yeah,
Let me look this up.
Well, that's also kind of quite. We're talking about that. There is a fascinating short story by Jorge Luis Borges, who is an Argentinian literary writer of intense imagination, and he wrote a story about the other Borges, and he keeps reading in the press about this Borges, and he walks into bookshops and he sees this Borges has written books that have his name on them, and effectively he's talking about it's a fascinating examination between the public persona and the actual person, and we all have a strange, even ourselves who are intensely minor public figures. I think if you Google us, it does have public figure next to our name, but we as far as public figures goes, we have a very small public. But even still, there is a weird relationship between you as you're publicly perceived, your public persona, and sometimes you drop in on threads where people are discussing your work or your activities, and you kind of you quietly lurk and read them all, and you're thinking, who the hell are they talking about? People you've never met, heard of, or didn't think you were connected to on any social media are discussing this character Bark or Jasper, and you think, really? Some of the time you sound like a twat, and you really think I wouldn't want to spend any time with this idiot asshole Jasper Bark. And other times you think, oh, that's quite strange. How amazingly prescient. So we all have a weird relationship between this doppelganger that is our public persona and ourselves, who perhaps might be a lot more spotlight shy than our public facing persona.
Yeah, and that's why I've retreated to Japan. If I was in Kidderminster, I'd be the talk of the town. Couldn't get past anyone. Probably the talk would be like, you've completely disparaged our town in
How
a
dare
couple
you,
of books, and we now want to kill you. But
dragging the good name of Kidderminster through the dirt,
yeah,
naked at that.
it's okay though. People from Kidderminster don't fly to Japan, so I'm safe here. But something you mentioned before was how Walt and Louise Simonson, they appear in the novel, and you actually did a round robin for this, and anything they said could then influence the direction of the book. So I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about logistically what that looks like, and how much were they given in advance? Did they read the parts before they showed up? Did they read everything? Were they given a briefing card? And was this round robin quite literally in real time? And how did it affect, the course of the book?
Um, it was slightly longer with Walt than it was with Louise. With Louise, it was more like a kind of like an email exchange. We would email each other backwards and forwards, and then a day or so later, one of us would respond to the other as the character was talking with her. And with Walt as well, Walt actually works for Fox Comics, the publisher who, in this alternate history of the novel, is still publishing. So I actually went back to their golden age, 1940s and 50s characters, and decided that those were IPs they would have continued to the present day. And Walt and I had a big conversation, given his career and the things he likes to work on, if he was working for Fox Comics, which one of their characters would he have worked on? And we kind of went through all their characters, all of whom are in the public domain. And he has like an artist collection of working on this character, which doesn't exist. He never worked on that character, but in this alternate universe, he did. And I told them a little bit about their relationship with Linda, but in order that they actually respond naturally, I didn't tell them very much. This is a friend of yours who does this, and she's been working on this, and she knows you from this. And then we took it off from there. So it wasn't until they actually got the novel in their hands that they worked out why their friend was acting in this rather bizarre and foolish manner.
That's amazing. And is it something now that you've done it with this novel that you kind of want to do in other novels, or have you scratched that itch for the time being and you don't need to bring other people in? We're not going to see David Moody show up at some point, or Ray Cluley stumble in.
It's funny because we all sort of occasionally borrow off friends' names to and I've another Run to Ground, with another short novella that I wrote. I named a lot of the characters after prominent people in the indie horror world, just for pure fun. I've certainly, people have borrowed my name and murdered me in their stories as well in the past. But yeah, bring people into my office. It's interesting. Walt and Louise had a huge fun doing it, and they said you should get loads of people in to do this. And should we invite so and so and so and so? And I kind of thought that will be logistically very, very hard to start taking my novel in different directions. It was a one of a series of kind of forgive me using the word literary for a piece of pulp fiction, perhaps with a few literary aspirations, but it was a literary experiment that I tried. It might be fun to try again, but I think it would depend upon the work. This worked with this work because it tied into the themes I was exploring in the wider story. If I go back to that theme and can find another interesting, a new way to do that, then definitely I'll do it. But if I don't, then I probably won't. And also, it's one of these things. Now I've done it, I'm sure lots of other people will do it. And as is often the case with these things, I'll have done this, and 5, 6, 7 years from now, if somebody else would do it, everyone would go, "Oh my God, what an amazing idea!" And that person will make vast amounts of money off it. And people read my work and go, "Oh, he's just ripping off that person."
Mm-hmm. It reminds me of that scene in that Rodney Dangerfield movie, Back to School. I don't know if you've ever seen it or not.
I haven't actually yet, but
yeah, it was done when Rodney was in his heyday, and one of the gags that they did was he had to go back to college, but he was a wealthy man, and he had to write a paper about Kurt Vonnegut, and he hired Vonnegut to write the paper. And then he got a C on the paper, which is, and Vonnegut's actually in the movie. It's like he's, because like he brings the paper to him, it's like the actual folder, so it's like, hey, Rodney did, well, what are you doing, so it's like, it's actually a very funny scene. But I always thought it was hilarious that he actually made like a C on the paper. It's like, Vonnegut wrote the paper and got a C on it. Of course he did.
I have a friend who's I had a friend. He's passed away quite a few years back, called Adrian Mitchell, who was a well-known British poet. He was part of the Mersey beat scene to a degree as well. And he'd always asked that his work not be used on exams. And one of his poems was chosen to be on GCSE, which is like a qualification you get in the UK at age 16. And they chose it, and the papers were printed up. And he found out about this, and he said, "Actually, I have actually got a moratorium on that. Please don't use it." And they said, "We kind of printed them all up now, and we can't really recall them. Why don't you come and sit the exam?" And so he sat down, and at that point is what it was all about. What do you think the poet was trying to say in this part? So he sat and wrote exactly what he was saying, and he got an F. He actually failed that exam. So the whole exam was about what did the poet say. When the poet sat there and told them what he was trying to say, these examiners failed him.
Folks, sometimes the curtains are blue. I mean, they're just, they're just blue. That's crazy.
But the thing is, Vonnegut would probably have gotten an E for the paper on his own work.
Yeah.
But that also kind of goes back to things like, the death of the author. I remember having a big conversation with Robert Shearman, who's a fantastic writer and also script writer. And he'd been invited out to this Estonian literary conference because they loved one of his stories. And they were sitting down going, I love this story. It is all about this. And he was going, "No, it's not." Like, no, it is. Like, I read the paper. It is all about this. And he was like, "No, it's not." And he had this stand-up row with all these academics who were trying to give him this award for this story, which they loved because they knew it was about this, and he knew it definitely wasn't about that whatsoever at all. And the fact of the matter is, it's one of the things you learn as a writer is you have no control over how your story will be received and what people will think about it, which is what Barthes was talking about in the first place with the idea of the death of the author. Just because you wrote it doesn't mean you actually necessarily know what it is or what it will mean to everyone else apart from you. You're just the first person who read that story, and your take on it, what you perhaps thought you might be doing, may not be how it will land with anyone else.
I think it was Kathy Koja who said early on in her career, she learned just not to correct any take that a reader had
I heard
on
that
her work.
podcast. There was she was talking about this. A reader came to an event she was at, and they discovered this mythical predecessor to her story, the cipher, which she wanted to call the glory hole. And this person was saying, "You meant this, didn't you? We're talking about this," and she was going, "No." And looking back now, she I think she says in the podcast, and I wish I'd been a bit more sympathetic and had understood that my view is not the kind of last final word on my work, which I think we all learn and discover. And that's one of the joys and one of the many burdens you have to carry as well as an author.
Yeah. And the kind of simplified version of this is when Sean Hudson was on the podcast, and he said, about the movie adaptation of Slugs. He said, well, if people say it's good, he's like, yeah, well, of course it's fucking good. I'll write the book. And then if they say, like, oh, it's not good, he's like, yeah, well, it's not the fucking book, is it? It's like, okay, thank you, Sean. But yeah, oh, Sean was a trip to have on the podcast. I remember when I asked him what the low point of his career had been, and he said, well, apart from sitting here talking to you, Michael. Fucking Sean.
Well, this is definitely the apotheosis of my career, coming on here talking with you two gents about Draw You In, which I would like you all to buy in case you haven't guessed by this point in the podcast. Yeah. Actually, I have to confess as well, Sean Hudson is like the ultimate kind of guilty pleasure when it comes to kind of reading kind of like pulp horror. I can't quite, I've never really liked Guy N. Smith, even when I was kind of like 12 years old and first encountering his work. And forgive me if you do like Guy N. Smith. I'm sure there's many other things we agree upon. But yeah, Sean Hudson, you could say you could level any manner of criticisms against his work. Richard Damon's another author like that, and I'd probably have to agree with you on but at the same time, I take a tremendous kind of pulpy pleasure. I think as well. Also, I mean, one of the things perhaps again all three of us as authors have in common, that we do have some literary aspirations. We do have some understanding the mechanics of literary conceits. We do know how to use them in our work. But at the same time, we love the visceral thrill of absolute pure pulpy goodness as put up by people like Sean Hudson. And it's wonderful if you can write work that spans that entire divide. I don't know if we can successfully. And all too often, you kind of fall between two stools. And when I say the word stools, I'm not talking about things you sit on. And plummet into the abyss of kind of pure pretentiousness because you fail to land on either things. But occasionally it's kind of nice to span that divide, to write something that does have some literary merit and at the same time has exactly the same visceral thrill as reading Slugs or Assassins or any number of Sean Hudson books that I tend to hide when my black turtleneck wearing literary friends come round to visit. Oh, I don't know where that got on my shelf.
Yeah, I think, it's about kind of with literature as well, knowing the rules and then consciously deciding to break them.
Yeah.
I know how to structure a piece of literary fiction, but sometimes I just want to write a novel about 7 like-minded blokes who want to get their dicks out on Naked Attraction, and that's fine too. And On the note of guilty pleasures, I've been saying for a while now, and probably because the professors at university did put this idea of guilt and shame and, oh, you don't want to be reading that. So my kind of reaction is there shouldn't be guilty pleasures. It's like I can read something and know that it's not like a meticulously crafted literary novel, but I can still say I enjoyed the hell out of it. Just like with music, there's some kind of hardcore metal or punk that I'll listen to, and I know that it's not as intricately put together as, like, let's say, some prog rock, but I still enjoy the hell out of it. So, we should remove guilt from our pleasures, and then all we're
Yeah.
left with is pleasure. And doesn't that make for a wonderful world?
It's like a really good diet includes, on the one end, you can go and have like a 3 Michelin-starred meal at an amazingly great restaurant. On the other hand, you can have like a dirty, nasty, greasy pizza or a burger, and both of those things can bring intense pleasure to you. And I think a well-rounded kind of diet should include them all. So your reading matter. It's great to read, firstly, outside the genre that you write in, to read a variety of things. It's great to read writers who are fabulous technicians and amazing wordsmiths, but it's also great to just read absolutely mindless stuff which brings you great pleasure. It's the same between people who read like the FT and the Economist at the same time, and maybe academic publications like the New York Review of Books will also sit and scroll through pictures of cats on their phone. It's no difference between doing that, reading Jonathan Franzen or Victoria Egan or Dostoevsky or Virginia Woolf, to reading a really trashy piece of fiction purely for the pure fun of it. Both my children, when they went through university, in order that they didn't stop reading like many people do the minute they leave college, you look at their bookshelves and they're almost like frozen in aspic. They never read another book again because they've been forced to read books. I bought them loads of trashy rubbish to read in order that they remembered that reading was for pleasure. The fortunate thing about a lot of academics is they forget that people actually read as a pure visceral pleasure because it's fun, because they're reading for their job and they're reading to analyze stuff. So yeah, as both of my children went through higher education, I kept giving them crappy trash to read that they would just enjoy, and we should all do that. That you should have a mixed and varied diet. It's perfectly fine to read Hello alongside To the Lighthouse. Both are totally valid things, and it's perfectly fine to read on the one hand House of Leaves, and on the other hand Rats by James Herbert, or The Sucking Pit by Guy N. Smith, if that gives you pleasure.
There you go. You've given me a good marketing idea, and I use the term good very loosely, but I'll just start turning up to
Loosely. How about those schools?
graduation. Yeah, yeah. I'll
Like those
start turning
schools.
up to graduation ceremonies specifically for undergraduates. And if I don't get arrested, then after they've graduated, I will hand them each a copy of Daddy's
Actually,
Boy. And
read
then,
this.
since you gave me the idea, I'll give them a copy of Draw You In, but only volume 1, because then they have to buy the other 2.
Yeah, see, this is all part of my marketing scheme.
Yeah.
Get them hooked.
But,
Yeah, but
maybe
it was
loitering outside the graduation ceremony, I might get arrested before I give them the books. So,
for pushing
swings and
illicit
roundabouts.
substances. But
Yeah.
again, that could be great publicity. Arrested for giving away books at a university.
Yeah.
What is
There
this,
you go.
Soviet Russia?
But I
But
mean,
anyway,
I
both of these.
hope that everybody who has listened to this will go out and read Draw You In, and if for no other reason, then it will be like nothing they have read before. I mean, we said before, it's a very ambitious book. It's impossible to comp, as Bob said, and it's really impossible to put in a genre because it, as you said, it jumps from genre to genre and back again, and it's just ambitious in its scope. The fact that you've put out essentially a 300,000 word novel, it works for those interested in comic books, it works for those who want to learn about it, it works for those who have no interest whatsoever. So for goodness sake, I mean, go out and buy the book.
Thank you very much. Yes, please do.
And you said that this is part of Bark Bites Horror. Not only did you say it, it's slapped in the corner of each of the books.
Yes.
What is next from Bark Bites Horror? And then what is Bark Bites Horror? Are there horror books that you could write that would not fit into Bark Bites Horror? Or does this mean any book written by you that is horror is automatically a Bark Bites Horror?
I think that if I was to write a book that wasn't Bark Bites Horror, it would kind of have to be either very cliched or very much in like treading the same old ground everyone does. Effectively, Bark Bites Horror, if you've got a jaded palate, if you've read far too many books about zombie apocalypses or sparkly vampires, and you're fed sick and tired of all the old cliched tropes. A special forces person finds himself facing an apocalyptic landscape. They have to fight their way across in order to go and save a member of their family, or a couple who have undergone a traumatic experience in their past move to the countryside and buy an old house in order to do it up, to overcome their problems and start finding strange supernatural happenings occur to them. All those plots, like time-worn plots we see time and time and time again. If you're sick and tired of those, I want to find out where horror is going, where horror will be in the next 10, 15 years, then Bark Bites Horror is where you go to. For those with a jaded palate who want to see horror 2.0 regened, retooled, reinvented, who want something they've never read before, that's what the series is there for. What's coming next? There's a weird western called Dead Scalp, which is like no other weird western you've read before. That's coming out in the end of August. A little bit later on, I have a Southern Gothic paranormal thriller called Harmed and Dangerous coming out at the end of the year. After that, I have a collection of 4 novellas, a new collection, and a new book called The House That Hunted Troubled Souls, coming out in 2026. So those are the next 5 publications, which are slated. Kind of 3/4 of those are written. So they're all, and certainly, obviously, Dead Scalp and Harmed and Dangerous are fully written and awaiting their slot in Crystal Lake's publication schedule. And yeah, so that's basically what Bark Bites Horror is. It's the new stuff. When you're fed sick and tired of all the old stuff and all the old ground that's been constantly retrod, when you don't necessarily want to see yet another virgin or someone who's just lost their virginity stabbed in the wood by a slasher, you want a new take, you want to see new horrors, this is why you check out the Bark Bites Horror series. And every single one of those novels is introduced by the cartoon version of myself.
All right, what a fantastic slate of forthcoming releases. And I mean, goodness, the amount that you've got that are kind of either fully finished or are well on their way. How long, with the obvious exception of Draw You In, which is 300,000 words, how long does it typically take for you to write a novel from kind of the initial idea to the ready to send to the publisher?
If I was writing to like to the maximum profit yield, I'd be working to like an MVP, like minimum viable product, which is kind of like those who like churn out 30 or 40 novels a year tend to work to. I have this unfortunate habit of writing my novel all over again. I get to the first draft, and by that point, I've worked out what novel I should have written, and now I go back again and write it all over again. So, while I can usually aim to write about 1,500 to 2,000 words a day, roughly 5 to 6 days per week, that actually does mean I churn out a lot of material by the end of the year. But unfortunately, quite often I have to go back and correct my mistakes and draft and redraft and redraft and redraft until, because I'm a bit of a perfectionist. So that kind of works against putting out a minimum viable product, which is something I don't do. So I can kind of do like a novel, 2 novellas, and 1 or 2 other side projects, graphic novels and things, probably per year. But also the kind of strange thing is about publishing, you probably both know yourselves, work tends to bunch. You kind of work away on a kind of a steady scale. And some years it'll look like you hardly done anything whatsoever at all. And then other years it looked like you're ridiculously prolific. And that's just the vagaries of publishing and publishing schedules. And the competition you have for publishing slots in your publisher's schedule, or whether you want to publish it yourself and then take on board all the extra work involved with that. Really. So, but yeah, I aim for about 1,500 to 2,000 words a day. That works out about 300,000 words a year, which could be 3 books. It can, or other things. It would be a lot more if I wasn't so meticulous and perfectionist about polishing my work endlessly. And that's exactly how I polish it, just like that. I send my thing.
Well, I was gonna say that I'm very much the same, and I guess I am in whatever way we're talking about. Very meticulous, do like a good polish, and if I didn't, then I might get more work out per year, and people can interpret that however they wish. And on that note, where can readers connect with you? Maybe I shouldn't ask that question on that note. Unrelated. We don't need polishing places. Just where can people interested in your writing connect with
Right.
you?
Well, if they want to see me polishing things, I do have an OnlyFans page where I polish any number of things.
I mean, I know, and you're very quick to respond to private messages on there too. You look after your fans.
I do indeed. But if they want to read my work or connect with me, do check me out on jasperbark.com. I'm on most social media, from Facebook to LinkedIn, still on Zitter. It's now called X. It was Twitter. I haven't, unfortunately, migrated there, but I'm not very active. I'm on Blue Sky, Instagram, Threads, most social media. You can probably track me down. Haven't got a TikTok channel, but I do have a YouTube channel. But yeah, probably the best place to start is go and look for me on jasperbark.com. And also, my books are for sale on most platforms, from Amazon to Barnes and Noble, Rakuten Kobo, Audible. Go check me out.
All right. Do you have any final thoughts to leave our listeners and viewers with?
Talking about reviews, it was lovely of you to say my work was uncategorizable. one of the regular comments is that I've never read anything quite like this before, and the other one is I started this novel thinking, oh yes, I know where this is going, and within 40 pages I realized I had no idea where it was going, and if you'd told me where it was going to end, I would never have guessed that. So again, this is work that will surprise you, catch you off guard, and take you to places you would never have dreamed, because I've dreamed of them, and I have the complete lack of sanity to prove it. Not to mention the grey hairs in places we can't mention.
Despite your continuous mentioning. And on that note, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me on. It has been a huge, huge pleasure.